welcome. I'm so glad you were able to make it today. I'm even more happy that Jen was able to make it today. I'm paraphrasing, but she said, I'm going to give a talk at WNL come hell or high water. And then high water came. And it held her off by 2 days, but she came. She came, so we're really excited for her to be here. This is Jen Boyle, and flip it on me. She's an associate professor of English and the coordinator of the BA program in digital culture and design, as well as the new media and digital culture at minor at Coastal Carolina University. She teaches and writes about questions of media transformation and theories of mediation. Her scholarship and teaching explore new media objects and performance, bodies and technology, and the virtual and material flows of objects and information through networks from the 17th century to the digital present. A recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, Jen is a member of the editorial board of the journal Post-Medieval and of Punctum Books. Yeah? Okay. Her first monograph, you guys make fun of computer scientists and their words, but Anamorphosis in Early Modern Literature, Mediation and Effect. Looks at how the technologies and media perspective in the early modern period offer us a different way of thinking about our own digital technologies, webs, and interfaces. She's currently working on 3 different projects. She has a new monograph titled The Virtual Sovereign, an experimental, interactive, and multimodal study of networks in theological, political, and sexual sovereignty. I don't usually get to say those kinds of things when I give intros. She has a collaborative project titled Zombie Shakespeare on the platform in Media Race. I'm working on the movie rights for Zombie Shakespeare, and she's co-editing with local hero Wan Chuan a collection of essays titled The Retrofuturism of Cuteness. So I hope you all enjoyed her talk and you brought your laptops, and welcome Jen Boyle.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I just want to emphasize, so I'm probably going to not talk about any of that. No, there'll be some of that in my talk today, but and I'll give you kind of an overview of where I'm going to go with things this afternoon. But first of all, I just want to say again how much I appreciate how gracious and active you all have been in accommodating me. I am in South Carolina, and though we weren't personally affected, we literally had National Guard units on each end of our city 2 days ago, so travel was not a possibility, and I really appreciate you making it possible for me to be here today, and thank you, my colleague and collaborator Wan Chuan, for making this possible as well. So I am an associate professor. I won't go back over too much of what she's going to say in the interest of time. But I am directing a brand new program in digital culture and design. It's a bachelor's program right now, about to become a master's program. It's also connected to a brand new facility called the Digital Commons for Humanities and Arts, sort of like the wonderful setup that you have here. And it's connected to a variety of initiatives at Coastal Carolina, including our Ashes to Art program, where we have students, we have partnerships with universities in Greece and Egypt. Students go, they work on ancient sites, ruins, and then come back and do 3D reconstruction in the context of critical studies of these kinds of historic sites. So lots of stuff happening. One of the great things I love about these kinds of talks are the connections that I make. We had Jason Farman at Coastal from University of Maryland, and it's turned out to just be a wonderful connection and collaboration, and you're just doing such interesting stuff here. I hope that we'll be able to pursue some of that in the future, ideally. So my talk today is going to cover really sort of this idea of timeliness, really form, digital form or digital objects across 2 registers. The first is thinking a little bit historically. I am trained as an early modernist and a theorist in English, and then moved towards mediation, media studies, and the digital humanities. And so those 2 things are very present in my work, as I'll talk about at the end of this talk. And then I also want to talk about the kind of point of my talk today is making an argument about forms, about digital forms themselves, rather than the products or the outcomes that we see with them. And in that context, we'll end up today, I'll have a little talk I'm going to give, not very long, and then we're going to just look at some stuff on our laptops, and I'll have them projected up here. We'll look at some sample sites and some objects And we have maybe an opportunity for a little bit of an exercise in conjunction with your classes, potentially, if we have time. All right, so I'm going to get started here, and though I am going to start with kind of a little preamble talk. If you want to interrupt me at any point, it's that kind of thing, please feel free to do so. The title of the talk is The Untimely Potential of Digital Humanities, and we're going to start with something from the early modern. This is a quote from Francis Bacon from The Advancement of Learning in 1605. In 1605, at the apex, in many senses, of the European Revolution in print, Francis Bacon offers his version of a kind of transhuman, or even I call it a kind of cyborg manifesto, a treatise meant in part to reform education, but also to highlight the transformation in learning brought about by the mediating or remediating influences of technologies like the printing press, the telescope, the microscope, and an array of other organs of reflection, as he phrases it. And the quote here, are not the organs of the senses of one kind with the organs of reflection. The eye with a glass, the ear with a cave, or straight, determined, and bounded. Neither are these only similitudes of men of narrow observation may conceive them to be, but the same footsteps of nature, treading or printing upon several subjects or matters. And so the first thing I want to draw attention to is this comparison that he's making literally with the artificial extension of our organs, mediating technologies, and the kind of organic properties of our own senses. And then he goes on to bring in this idea of treading, which I absolutely love in the context of printing as well, because treading for me is this idea of stasis, of an imprint, of something being left behind that we associate most directly with print media, but also movement and procedure. And that's kind of what the direction I want to go today, and some of the things I'm going to be talking about in terms of digital form. Bacon's statement here not only argues for the symbiotic affordances of the human-machine connection, but also for a model of knowledge reproduction likened to both printing and treading, or footsteps, leaving imprints across subjects and matters. And indeed, the very frontispiece to his text functions as a kind of interactive interface meant to represent how the triangulation, or really sort of reckoning, between abstract and applied knowing will lead to a new epoch of experimental discovery in his thinking. And we have philosophia, scientia, and then we have this ship here, and the ship, of course, at his moment is meant to represent active experimentation, commerce, colonialism, but also the applied arts. And so there's this, sort of, we're being directed to kind of sort of read in a very active way sort of how he's placing this particular sort of approach to the reform in education and a reform in thinking about empiricism in particular. And then this one, which is a little bit later in the same century, is from Leibniz, and it's called, this is a figure associated with the art combinatoria. And this actually is a computer, an algorithm, so this really is interactive. And without getting too deep into it, Leibniz here is trying to sort of represent conceptually all the possible categorizations of knowledge and knowledge production. And then all these little paths are meant to be, you could think of it as kind of a Ouija board of knowledge production, where you would follow these out in all these different combinations to sort of exhaustively pursue all the different ways that these different sort of combination of knowledges might come together. So Bacon's approach to empirical knowledge, and knowledge whose expression is grounded in an interactive object, is not unique to the early modern period. And we see Leibniz examples here, but there are plenty of others. The treading or reproduction of knowledge, understood as motional or interactively derived, comes close to what in the present context we might refer to as procedural aesthetics, where outcomes are dependent upon both an imprint, something left behind, and new iterations or movement. This is Janet Murray, author of Hamlet on the Holodeck, and she coined this phrase initially in the context of gaming environments, but it's now been applied to a whole different sort of host of digital interactive environments. Procedural affordance has created a new representational strategy, as powerful as spoken language or recorded moving images, the simulation of real and hypothetical worlds as complex systems of parameterized objects and behaviors. And again, the emphasis here on how these things are constantly moving, procedurally in motion. And of course, at our moment, the language and catalyst for such affordances is code. Right? Digital code is a procedural language that is dependent upon the outputs that are moving or treading productions. This is a It's a little dark. I don't know if you can see it. I'm looking at it from the sideways, so maybe you've got a better view of it. But this is an art installation, and it's meant to represent this tension between these two aspects of digital environments. The circles are outputs. So these are meant to represent places where you'd be seeing text or images on a screen, let's say. And these cascading zeros and ones, these binaries back here, are meant to represent the motional procedures of switches on and off, all that stuff that's going on behind the scenes when you're on the computer or on your phone, right, and all that stuff happening. Really drawing forward this idea of the procedure, the motional form or procedural form. And we have another one here. This is John Cayley's, it's an electronic literature collection piece. And it's called Translation, and the whole piece is structured around these slow-moving translations of text, German into French, French into English. And while you're watching the translations of the text takes place on the screen, you'll have over here, and it's hard to capture this in a static image, his representations of the actual images of the actual code operations going on in the computer. So the computer language as a procedural emotional form actually shows up in the context of this particular installation. So we need only glimpse the machinations of examples of digital textuality like this to see procedural effects or procedural affordances at work. And in the case of Cayley, we can really think of this piece as a kind of time-based poetics, because we're not only sort of temporally seeing sort of the unfolding of the translations of the text, but we see the temporality of the modalities of the computer environment or the code environment as well. All right. An interesting or perhaps unintended consequence of the dominance of print media over many years now has been the advancement of the myth that content can effectively be excised from its mediating form. And we might trace this privileging of conceptual meaning divorced from form to all sorts of social and cultural emergences. For example, the embrace of solitary authorship, right? Which is this idea of an isolated, solitary figure with an authorial power that's kind of separate from the machinations that produce a book, that produce a text. But it suffices to say that print has in general tended to emphasize conceptual content over procedural formalities, procedural aesthetics. And a dramatic example of as much is the evolution of William Blake's work from the 18th century, writer, artist, image maker. And this is what Blake's work would look like in the 18th century. A poetics, textual poetics, these lively, vibrant, really amazing. Every time I look at these, they remind me of something out of even like the 1930s. They have this almost trans-historical feel to them, right? Vibrant images. And then the canvas for this, the procedural form for this, is these dripped acid sketch copper plates that he used for this very complicated reverse printing process. And Blake himself, in talking about his work, really makes the point that the work itself is about all of that, the embodiedness of making the plates, of going through the procedures of this. And this is what his aesthetics is about fundamentally. But of course this becomes this in the 20th century. And if you've ever taught with a Norton text, that brick that you use to hold the door open, right? I really, the Norton is just, it's gotten to be ridiculous, right? I mean, now we have the web compendium to go with it, but it's still kind of ridiculous. But this is how you encounter Blake, and you still, even with the web compendium, if you get the text, you can maybe flip to the center and look at the images. But the argument here, conceptually and practically, is that this makes sense, that you can pull that text away from that very complicated procedural form and present it this way, and you're still retaining something substantive about what Blake is after. Interestingly, with the emergence of digital culture and the digital humanities, we come back to this. This is the Blake Archive, a very early, and many of you are nodding, a very early digital humanities project that we now in some ways think of as being somewhat obsolete, but still is a very sort of vibrant example of the kinds of choices and thoughts that have to go into creating an environment to sort of achieve procedurally what you're after conceptually. So in this sense, not only do you get the images linked back to the text, but there's all sorts of lightbox options and these other kinds of things that allow in some ways to be more Blake to some extent, without being too essentialist about it in the digital moment. than we were certainly able to achieve with print. Okay, so what all this brings me to is an argument about digital objects, particularly in the context of digital humanities, that might turn us to newly framed questions about the profound significance of form. And I hope the examples I offer here at least point in the direction of an engagement with the digital humanities, a very troubled term in some ways right now, that is less about an annoying utopian narrative of progressive unfolding into the future, of some sort of superior sort of effort around the humanities, and perhaps one more about something more historically, methodologically fundamental to the humanities. So I'm making an argument here that's like sort of kind of pulling the past forward, pulling that sort of temporal space of an even earlier humanities methodology forward in a way that perhaps we don't always think about. One of the issues, in my opinion, with the digital humanities at present is that it often tends to appropriate forms of production, databases, interfaces, Cartesian mapping systems, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that themselves make outdated or even problematic arguments as procedures, as environments, as forms, all the while rhetorically asserting access to a more public humanities, a more open framing to our work, and a democratic kind of approach to knowledge production in the humanities. And one of the arguments I want to make here, and we're going to get to this even in two-dimensional environments, is that we have to start thinking as much about the forms of what we do and the platforms and procedures as the conceptual and rhetorical arguments surrounding many digital humanities and digital projects. So form, as I'm conjuring it here, is not meant in terms of thinking about how vehicles for content change their representational registers. This is not so much a Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, as it is thinking about an ontology of form. And I'm not going to get too far off into the kind of theoretical framing of this, though we're going to look at it in a very grounded way in terms of some examples. But of thinking about form as moving iterative potentials for reframing conceptual categories of meaning that we take for granted. My colleague Henry Turner, who I'm working on a project with right now at Rutgers, early modernists like myself, is looking at this idea strictly in the context of the early modern framework, and really is interested in how we've lost touch within the dominance of the print era in some ways, with a notion of form that's not a static architecture or an immanent closed ideas, genres, right? Coordinates, these kinds of, kind of cordoned off ideas of thinking in terms of form or formalisms, and you can, this cuts across sociological, structural, linguistic, but which flourishes renewing relational networks. And the digital is is ripe with the potential to really sort of think about this and productively exploit this. So this brings us to questions of what we do when we do the digital humanities. And my main focus from here on out is going to be looking at some projects and interfaces that show us some competing ontologies of form and the aesthetic and cultural implications of as much. And I do think that this represents a shift in our thinking about the digital, and that it moves us away from questions about access and representation, all very important objectives, and I want to really emphasize that, to how engaging form in the context of the digital raises the specter of potentially a more radical ontology of digital reproduction. And my particular experience today is going to be about kind of bodily experiences of spatiotemporality, mapping in both time and space. We're going to look initially at some, what we might even call digital installations that come close to physical cinema, but then we're going to switch the focus to two-dimensional environments and talk about how we can think about these same registers in two-dimensional environments and platforms as well. And my hope is to introduce you to some things, maybe some particular platforms. I mentioned this earlier to Paul Youngman, and he mentioned he knew about it. How many of you know of Scalar and have worked with Scalar out of USC? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that and what they're trying to do in terms of some of these kind of formalisms when we get to the applied start. But we're going to start with a video of a walk. It'll become pretty clear here in a minute, the implications of what that means, by Janet Cardiff and George Miller. I don't know if many of you know their work. They're digital artists that play around literally with using very simple, sometimes, digital platforms, social media tools, and the video that you have on your iPhone to play around with this idea of moving across different spatial, temporal environments and the implications of myths. So we're going to start with this. This is a walk that's taking place in a German train station that was used as a kind of transition point for victims of the Holocaust and is now still an active train station. And they've done this kind of walk, and it's set up in the same way that you might do these walking tours that you go on at the museum, except it's in this train station space. So let's start with this.
Okay, turn the camera on, press the video button. I'm sitting here right now with you in the train station in Kassel, watching the people pass by. It's very intimate in ways, watching people. You can see how they walk, so you can tell if they're happy or sad or lost somewhere in their minds. This video will be an experiment. We're like those prisoners stuck in Plato's cave. We watch the flickering shadows on the screen. Try to align your movements with mine. Move your screen up to the left as I do. A red coat. I used to have one. Wonder where it went. So many people wear black here. Garbage pails have moved. Do you see the musicians? They're between the pillars now. Let's get up. Follow them. And turn to the right. Try to follow the image. Now stop and watch. Let's continue.
All right, so I'm going to stop it here. I'll just let you know that she goes on with this. The narrative continues, and they end up actually in some spaces on the side of the station where they're looking at actually sort of a memorial space that's been set up spatially for victims of the Holocaust. The intervention here, the digital intervention here, in this case, involves a juxtaposition of the affordances of the form of digital video with the perceptual and temporal landscape of embodied movement through space, both equally required. And she actually, we can't really hear it in this environment, but the one really kind of sophisticated digital adjustment here is the use of binaural sound, so that it creates almost like a sense that you're actually you're in that environment yourself. It's very moving and disturbing at the same time if you actually are on the walk with the headphones on, listening to it the way that they've recorded it. The dominant spatiotemporal experience of moving through the train station is one of the present of physical and perceptual immediacy. By using a digitally recorded version of the space, one crafted with a narrative that draws attention to other temporal spaces, historical events, given that this was a transient space for victims of the Holocaust, as well as personal remembrance, the red coat. This event space emerges as a kind of critical displacement of how we experience the threshold of actual and virtual temporal experience. And the result of this is a sense of time that comes close to what a theorist Derrida might call a hauntology, where there's this kind of haunting that's taking place with the layering of these two very different spatiotemporal environments. The disjunction between the actual temporal experience and the virtual temporal experience creates a sense of productive haunting. Experiences layered over one another that draw attention to the relationship between, say, lived time, historical time, and memory. I note here a quote from Franz Kafka, the writer, when talking about an earlier media transition around sound, made the statement that those who build new media to eliminate the spectral element between people create ample breeding ground for more ghosts. And this is a piece that is actually using the threshold of its forms to really sort of engage with this idea of ghosting in a really productive way. But this doesn't have to be something that happens physically with a sense of embodiment of moving. It can be very perceptual. And as I'm going to talk about in these next two things that I'm looking at here, it can be decisions that begin as conceptual decisions and thinking about perceptual affordances and environments and creating some of these effects as well. So I'm going to talk about two projects fairly briefly, and then we're going to open up the computers and actually look at some sites. And these are two projects that I have been involved in. The first, whoops, I've got to do my little Alt tab here. The first is a contemporary project that I'm working on in Scalar at the moment. And when we pull, we're going to look at another example in Scalar called the knotted line, which is this really interesting experimentation with a timeline. I'll talk about Scalar and some of the things that it's trying to do, and it's still in beta and it has some bugs, but it has a really interesting objective, I think, in terms of digital humanities projects. This is called Observations Upon a Blazing World, and I'm interested in this early modern woman writer named Margaret Cavendish. Anybody know who Margaret Cavendish is? Yeah. Who, just to give you a quick survey, is a real problem for the print era because she's called Mad Madge. She produced some of the earliest what we call kind of romantical science fiction in the English language called The Blazing World, World called The Blazing World. And she was also a fairly serious experimental philosopher and empiricist. I mean, like, wrote some couple pretty serious philosophical treatises. You know, talking about form and the conflicts of form, especially around genre, nobody knew what to do with Margaret Cavendish through the entire part of the 20th century. You'd get her romantical fiction, and then Cambridge came along in the 1990s and produced her Observations Upon experimental philosophy that was really kind of a, you know, it wasn't even treated seriously scientifically. It was like history of philosophy. But the two were never really presented together. They were never offered together. And when she first produced this, she produced them together. And not only did she produce them together, she called this a hermaphroditical text, a hybrid hermaphroditical text that was meant for you to be moving between these two different forms of her writing and to be making the connections across the text. So what we're trying to do with this project is we're trying to recreate, not just conceptually by offering the two texts together, but in terms of the formal properties of the digital environment that we're using, we're trying to code an environment that allows for both the movement between these two texts, so you feel the kind of perceptual activity of moving between these two texts, and also randomness, which is a big thing in her work as well. The randomness of coming across, you know, here's a version of hybridity. Oh, here's a version of hybridity around gender over here, and moving kind of back and forth across these lines. So I'll talk a little bit more about sort of what the kinds of things that we're using to create this. But the idea, and this is created in Scalar, but the idea at this moment is fundamentally to use the platform itself, the forms itself, to argue along with the conceptual presentation of the materials themselves, so that at a perceptual level, you're having an affective experience that's mirroring what we're trying to do representationally with the content. One more, and then we're going to look at some other sites online. One of the things I didn't mention is that I'm familiar with your neck of the woods. I was at Hollands University for a few years before I took the position at Coastal Carolina, trying desperately to do DH in a liberal arts, women's liberal arts environment. environment, which is getting much easier now, right? I mean, there's things happening, and it's very exciting. It's very difficult. Fortunately, I was able to forge a collaboration with the Center for Human-Computer Interaction at Virginia Tech. We got some NSF funding for this, and then some NEH funding later on. Started in 2009. It actually had a long life, 3 years, and has gone internationally now. It's was part of a featured new versions or new visions on locative digital installations in Brazil. So very quickly, I'll give you an overview of what this is. It's called the Hollands Community Project, and the centerpiece for this are two things. One's a text and the other is a space. This little spot over here you can barely see. There's a trail that runs off the side of campus called the Hollands Community Trail. And it was a trail utilized. Hollands is a university with a slave legacy, which means that young women years ago, prior to emancipation, brought their slaves with them to the university. Many of the people still working at the university can trace there, and there's been some really interesting controversies around this. It's a very complicated history for the university. This is not only spatially marginalized. The university claims it doesn't own it, doesn't know anybody owns it. It's literally a border space of nowhere land over here. Doesn't show up on county documents, doesn't exist. Ethel Morgan Smith in 2007 wrote a book called From Whence Cometh My Help, which is this creative, she was a graduate student in creative writing at Hollands, which is a kind of creative nonfiction piece that mixes narrative pieces with documentary evidence, primary materials, all trying to record the experiences of the members of the Holland community. These slaves that came with students, worked at the university, after emancipation stayed on, continued to work at the university, and again, their relatives still make up a population of the service personnel at Hollands. There it is up there. So what we did is we created this project where, first off, working with coders, we created this thing called tuple space. And the only way to describe it is to say it was the cloud before the cloud was the cloud. So we created this little sort of mini server space, this sort of virtual space where we could load in images and narratives and documents. We gave students tablets, and we sent them up in this space. And this space is really rich experientially because it was an art installation. There was an art history professor there for a while. It took students out and had them build things in this meadow out here. There's shotgun shells. There's old deer carcasses. While the students are out there recording their sort of impacts perceptually, affectively in the environment, there's headsets involved in this too, in terms of sound and text. They're seeing pieces being fed into the virtual space that are, for example, a small narrative piece of women describing leaving stones along the trail so their children could find them if they had an emergency when they were on the university campus and the children were still at home. I have to tell you, the outcomes of this just even really shocked us. We took it, we used a classroom, several classrooms. Students got tremendous things out of this, and then afterwards they'd come back from these experiences, they'd build early versions of kind of WordPress sites around this. They took on multiple forms. Here's a little kind of overview of how the whole thing worked, the tuple space. This is from an article that they did at Virginia Tech. I don't know what's going on with the stick people, but this was their, somebody who's interested in form. I'm not sure about the stick people, but and you can reorder the sequences, so there's this plane with narrative that goes on. And we later on, we came to call this tuple space a virtual memory theater. So again, the kind of formal properties of the virtual environment that they're working in is creating these disjunctions and also mirroring some of the sort of conceptual efforts that we were after in terms of the project. All right. So what I'd like to do now is look at some sites, some projects out there around questions of how they're using, or the kinds of things, the questions we can ask about the forms and the modalities they're making use of in their individual projects. Mapping is really big right now, and there's so much interesting stuff going on with mapping. But what's really interesting to me is that one of the problems with mapping is that we're dealing with kind of an old Cartesian system of time and space. You know what I mean by that? I say a Cartesian time and space. Am I talking nonsense? What do I mean by that? Yeah.
Time is linear. There is something that happens and something that happens afterwards, and then something happened beforehand.
Exactly. From what I understand, you're working on the notion of ennui in your class. How do you map a feeling of haunting or a feeling of the uncanny when you're in a space, right? Does that fit on a timeline? Does it fit in a kind of a spatial mapping environment? Yeah. Most of our mapping environments are about linear time. Something happened, something else happened. We've been spending years as people that study narrative and philosophy and history disrupting that idea. And yet now that we're moving into the digital era, we're kind of restricted often with this idea of very sort of limited ideas of time and space. It's a weird disjunction, one that I think can be made productive. But it's something that I think we need to begin to think about in different ways. All right, so I couldn't think of it. Yes, so you're already starting this. So the first site I want to look at is a project called the Green Book. This was a project, I think it started from the Low Country Digital Collection Project in South Carolina, and then the Digital Humanities Center at USC offered some support for this. But if you could go ahead and, it'd be great if I could, maybe I can send, well, I think the best thing is just punch in this URL and see if you can get them to come up on your computer, and then we'll look at them together here. So I'll give you a minute to pull that up, and then I'll project it up here while we're looking at it. Yeah?
Can you repeat that phrase that Cavendish used to describe her two forms?
Hermaphroditical.
Thank you.
Yeah. The hermaphrodite text. That's what she called it. She's crazy. I mean, just crazy interesting. No, crazy interesting. I just absolutely adore her. I think she's wonderful.
What year would that have been?
1668. And, yeah, 1668, and then there were multiple editions after that. But yeah, yep. All right, do we have stuff? Okay, let's go ahead and. Whoops. Oh. Did I minimize? Okay, this is fine. We'll just do it this way. Now we have all these. All right, get one less tab. Okay, so this is really kind of an important project. It's based on the 1956 Negro Traveler's Green Book. I don't know how many of you know these existed, but if you were traveling and you were a minority or black in the 50s or in the 60s, you had to know where to go to be safe, basically, where you could be housed, where you could get a meal. And so there was a book that was produced that would give you kind of a list of people in restaurants, these places called tourist homes, where you could go and get a room, right? A meal. And there's an accompanying digitization of the book itself, which is really a good resource to have as well. And it gives you some background a little bit on how the map was created and some of the sort of missing gaps and discrepancies that they had to deal with. But how would you describe this as a project? I mean, you know, sort of what is the outcome here in terms of mapping? Why the mapping? How is this working if you click around on it? What's your sense, just even sort of your feel for like how effective this is?
Well, it's important to get a sense of how much space isn't on there.
Exactly. Right, so one of the advantages, right, is we get to see that, well, there's clusters of these, and it's interesting just to even have a visualization of where the clusters are. to see the gaps. And so that's an important feature of that. And, and then there's this kind of interesting stuff going on down here, right? It's like we have these concentrations. One of the things that you might, in the next project, we're going to look at this notion of how you kind of can problematize representations in a spatial environment like this. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that there's a lot of these in the north, too, right? Which, some of the stereotyping that we have about that time is that, the north, you're okay. Down in the south, the south, when I first moved to the south, it's like, my goodness, the south. And of course, the reality is that we're talking about a much larger picture nationally. But what about in terms of how the information is inlaid into the map?
It's interesting, it's a contemporary map. So, contemporary to us, rather than, it's not a 1950s map, so we don't know what the building would have looked like, or, it's one thing I'm struck with. Since if we're encountering it in the present day rather than as it would have been in 1956.
Right, we've got a present day map, and then we've got these kinds of, this data that's been sort of positioned on this present day map, and we're coming to it from that temporal perspective.
Yeah, just to add to that, I immediately looked under Lexington, Virginia.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
it zoomed in on the Roseanne, which is this green dot on a contemporary map where there is no longer a building, there are just some parked cars, and it it maps in a way how much is lost.
Yes.
That sort of gap you were talking about.
Yes, yes, yes. So you can get to that with the search, right?
Yeah.
So take us through what you did.
I put in Virginia in that box.
In territory? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then
Whoops.
I realized they were in alphabetical order, and I just skimmed down to Lexington.
So let's go to Lexington.
Chose one of the three, and one of them I have known about, but I didn't know about the ones up on Main Street. So I looked at the Roseanne.
Let's pull that up. I'm trying out some new contacts. They're giving me grief. So,
Yeah,
so which one did you go to? The Roseanne?
yeah,
Yep. Zoom here. You can zoom in.
and then I zoomed once more.
Yep. So we now know. So what are they using to do this? Google Maps. Right. It's a Google map. Now, one of the things that's amazing about Google Maps, I'll talk about layering in a minute around this sort of idea of haunting, is that Google Maps lets you do some pretty cool stuff where this is concerned. It's actually a pretty fluid environment for allowing you to layer in video, text, to mark up the map in various ways. And of course, you have the zooming function. Google Earth is a really interesting phenomena. But Google Earth for me, again, I feel like sometimes I'm in a drone. And I've always wondered a little bit, like, I feel like I'm on some military surveillance trip. It's like, oh my God, I'm looking at these spaces that kind of, it's a weird effect for me. So I really appreciate the affordances of the platform and the things that it allows you to do in terms of layering different kinds of information and to creating disjunctions on a map. Like you said, you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, there's nothing there even anymore, right? What this is really interesting for, and I've done this with some other kinds of sites, is to go through something like this and then go through something like, you have a digital project you're looking at for Stonewall Jackson's burial site, and map out which ones get markers and which ones don't in the physical. That's in its own kind of interesting disjunction, right, to see what gets marked in the physical landscape as well. So one of the issues I have with Google Maps, and I think this is a really important project, and there's some really interesting things going on, but the first thing I think about is how could we do this in a way where I didn't feel like I was flying in about to do some sort of bomb strike on the location. And I think these things are important questions to ask. I think there are perceptual sort of affects that make a difference in terms of how we're thinking about these environments. Okay, one more that I think does some kind of different sort of interesting things here. And when I go to this one, I'm going to also, here, let me go back to the, I'm going to also, I have a little indentation here. I'm going to show you something called Topo Time. This is a new project that's trying to do exactly some of the things that we're talking about. This is called Visualizing Emancipation from Richmond. So we can pull that one up. Just out of curiosity while you're doing this, you're a coder, Sarah. How many others are there in this that actually work in some respect with the kind of back end of things and coding environments? And what's your, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm the director of technology for the library.
Okay, great.
I'm a librarian.
Okay, all right, and you code, you're active coders. That's interesting. So both in the, interesting, that's great. Yeah.
Because he's a VH librarian.
Yes, and you're a coder. Yeah, great. Okay, cool. All right, so do we have this pulled up? Let's. Okay, so you can read about this, take a minute and sort of read the overview on this, and then we'll go right into the interface. And this is doing something a little bit different than the other one was doing, I think, in terms of how it's using modalities of mapping. So this is a project that, visualizing emancipation, that's meant to look at recorded instances using various primary resources, including drawing off an earlier DH project called the Valley of the Shadow, which is really interesting, that shows sort of through primary documents, visualization, mapping, one town in the north and one town in the south during the entire span of the Civil War. This is looking at recorded instances of emancipation and then other kinds of events like movements of troops, and arrest records and these kinds of things to sort of complicate the picture of when, quote unquote, emancipation took place, right? You read in the history books, we get a date for it with the proclamation and the timeline after that. So there's a timeline at the base of this, right? And if you're working with timeline.js or even storymap.js, this kind of sliding bar kind of effect is fairly familiar. So let's go up to here, let the map regroup. And this has this interesting feature here. So we have emancipation events, we have Union Army locations, and we have this thing called the legality of slavery, where we're watching sort of legislative movements around sort of the illegalization of slavery, or whether slavery is still legal in these particular areas. But it has this little thing called, and I'm going to show you where this comes from in a minute, this little thing called a heat map. As it slowly loads. Right, and so what's your impression of what information is being offered with this? What's the emancipation heat map? Because it doesn't directly tell you when you get to like sort of the overview of the project what the heat map is attempting to do, differently than the little dots that you saw, which are using primary source materials to map discrete documents or events. What's this about, do you think? What's a heat map? Did anybody use a heat map for your phone for applications? Nobody uses a heat map? You have to be a foodie, I guess. Everywhere I go, I'm about food, so I use these heat maps to like see where people are eating, right? Like where the new hot restaurants are. Okay, so what this is doing is it's using a different mapping or looking at nuances around temporality and time. So it's in the center where you see these really strong red marks. You're looking at things that line up sort of with the historical record or documentary evidence in significant ways. The outer reddish areas are places where there's competing things going on. So you have maybe certain types of things that qualify as emancipation events alongside arrest of a group of blacks that were protesting, let's say, in a particular sort of environment that sort of resist that documentary evidence. And so this stuff at the outside where you get the more pink shades are places where you can't really distinctly put it on a map. You can't sort of place it in terms of documentary evidence. There's these competing events that you want to show in conflict or the disjunctions between them. And I just real quickly want to show you this. This is a web page. Whoops, wrong one. Here we go. Of new attempts. This is a group, Elijah Meeks and another programmer, who are trying to come up with different ways of presenting data, temporal data, spatial data, that go against this idea of the Cartesian sort of system. Nuanced temporal kind of landscapes. Spatial environments that we can't think of as really sort of linear. And if we go to the, right. So representing complex and or uncertain periods or events. And I'll send you these links so you can look at them. There's some really interesting things happening with this, of actually sort of trying to reconfigure what we think of as a map or a timeline in terms of how we represent things. And again, the idea is that you want sort of the back end of these things to perceptually and cognitively sort of create some affects that work alongside of what you're after with the conceptualization of some of these projects. All right, one last one. And if we have some time for maybe some questions, or I can talk a little bit about Scalar too. This is in Scalar. Wait, let me go back. Actually, this one should be easy to find if you just pull up knottedline.com. And once you get there, if you could go ahead and launch it. This one requires some real interactive. This is a project that's attempting to look at the history of confinement in the US, incarceration and confinement. So it's a timeline. And you can kind of pull out into, you know, the kind of recordings of temporal sequences that we're more familiar with. But the interface itself and some of these you have to really trap with your mouse as you move along. So what's your sense of where my students hate this piece? Why do you think they hate it? There's no sitting there clicking, like your mouse is moving, you're having to like follow, and it's like what just happened, you kind of have to go back, you got to work to get yourself back into the interface, right? You know, one of the results from a critical perspective of being in these environments, of course, we've heard this in multiple times, is our attention spans change. And we get very passive, you know, how about you're doing this all the time, right, when it doesn't respond immediately. We're used to sort of being, in terms of reception, we're used to like sort of receiving this information in very sort of straightforward ways. The question I think that really becomes a question about this kind of thing is where you cross from this being a really productive interface to maybe it being a little gimmicky. Right? And these are the kinds of questions to ask, like sort of what kinds of interfaces allow us to have to like sort of think and pause and create these kinds of disjunctions? And when does it just become something where you can't access it all and you're kind of clicking on it and just sort of encountering frustration over and over again? So this project was created in Scalar. You mentioned that you know something about Scalar. Are you working with it?
No, I've just dabbled a bit.
Yeah. What do you think of it?
It's interesting.
Yeah. Hey, let's go to so Scalar, let's get rid of the haunting music. This is from the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture. It's a collaboration between USC, University of Southern California. And they've received several NEH grants. I don't know if, it was just announced, I guess, last month. And they just got another one to continue working on this. It's still in beta development. And if you read a little paragraph here, it says that the Alliance for Networking Visual Culture seeks to enrich the intellectual potential of our fields to inform understandings of an array of visual practices as they are reshaped with digital culture. Our work explores new forms of scholarly publishing aimed at easing the current economic crisis faced by many university presses, while also serving as a model for media-rich digital publication. Now, there's two things about this. One is that the API for this is kind of unusual for publishing environments, and this is meant fundamentally to be available for academics to create these kinds of multimodal versions of their research or other kinds of projects. And you should really look through the library and the exhibits here. There's some interesting stuff going on. But there's all these other features that we won't have time to look at here where you can do these very interesting visualizations with your text, with the actual production that you create, between how many artifacts, how many videos, the actual kind of formalities of the environment itself are really quite fascinating. This is something I think to really look at. I think it's going in really interesting directions, and we don't have a lot of time. We've got like 5 minutes. We started a little bit later. Do we want to field some questions for 5 minutes, or what do you think?
I know some of you have classes to teach or to attend, so if you need to go, feel free, and if you can hang around, we'll hang around. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Yes, thank you.
And what we didn't get to, but I will send to you, is in Storyboard.js, StoryMap.js, I took a map of your campus, and I made a giggle pixel image. I wanted to talk about actually making maps out of images, but I have it for you if you want to use it maybe for an exercise for class in thinking about sort of maybe even creating some sort of exercises in layering its haunting here at WNL. Yeah. Yeah.
What is maybe I don't know if it's sort of the inverse of haunting or what, but my students in my regionalism class this semester did a collaborative map of American regionalism, so they each had to find places in the stories and put them on a Google map. And many of the places are fictional, so one of the questions was, if it's not a real place, how did you decide where you located it? And there wasn't any reason, like the instructions did not require that they did this, but several students used Google Earth.
Yep.
And they looked at the story and they said, this is what the story said the house looks like. And so I found this building in the approximate, area.
Right.
And so and somebody said, well, I figured a convenience store would be the analog of a general store.
Yeah.
And this one kind of looks like what I imagined it to be. And so, sort of the other direction, they're kind of importing that past into the present in a way that ended up being unexpectedly just fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something to emphasize is that, I'm making an argument about platforms and the development of platforms. I think we need to see more efforts in this direction. We forget that a lot of our tools come out of engineering, they come out of military applications, they come out of scientific framings, which is not a bad thing, but it's something to think about. But this is a conceptual exercise too. And I think that's a perfect example of how you can disrupt some of this, because what students tend to do when they get, and this is like it happens to me in class all the time when you start talking about mapping, is they want to put something on a Cartesian map. It's like, oh, I can place this here and I can place this there, and it's a very comfortable space for them to be in, and thinking about how to disrupt that. And that's an example of, fictional, the virtual and the real around spatial realities and that kind of thing, or the past and the present, the way that sort of that brings forward a different kind of disjunction or recognitions around past and present. Yeah. Other thoughts or?
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, sure.
Well,